We are ready. Chief, reporting in for chat. Yes, I missed last week. I totally forgot about it. Today I'm going to have a little bit of show and tell. I forgot to mention also that my new MOS was 98 Charlie, which was the Electronic Warfare Signals Intelligence Analyst. Try saying that multiple times fast. You can't. I've already talked a little bit about GAFB. Well, here we go. GAFB, Goodfellow Air Force Base. This is what we had to purchase for, I think, a whole $1. Had to wear it on your lower left leg, or the lower leg of your swim trunks, so you could go to the pool and not get questioned, so to speak. A little bit of the show and tell. Actually got something that says Fort Goodfellow on it. Get to that in a bit. Army t-shirt, yes, I was a skinny little kid still back then. So, be all you can be. They sold these down there. As soon as I got down there, I purchased one. My shorts have kind of lost their elasticity. But it does say Fort Goodfellow, San Angelo, Texas down here on the lower left leg. We'll get to that in a bit. Last week or a couple weeks ago, I mentioned the human wall. Like I said, the Air Force love to do their exercises. And this is where I started to grow my dislike and my eventual, I hate the Air Force. That's how I used to greet one of my Air Force sergeants, but we'll talk about that later on in my career. So I mentioned the human wall and how silly that was, because looking on it now, if anybody came out of that so-called building with a gun and shot it in the air or shot a couple of the human wall, we would scatter to the four winds. So much for a human wall blocking the bad guys inside this building. Like I said, the Air Force loved to play exercise. The Army loved to have fun. I think it was once a quarter we would do a thing called Soldier Sweepstakes, where we'd have 4 or 5 man team, get a dummy M16, and then we'd run around the track. The flight line went up and down the where all the buildings were for the school and the commissary and the BX and the barracks and everything else. So the flight line was up and down. It was like the main drag on the far side, and then the runways went off of that. So we used the flight line for this Soldier Sweepstakes. Basically what it was, I can't remember, it was like a mile or a little bit longer than a mile. But you passed the baton, the dummy 16, and at every station where you got to pass the baton, you had to perform a task. So by that time I had a drill sergeant. He goes, "Want a team?" "Yes, drill sergeant." So I got a team together, and of course I was on it. We did it on a Saturday, if I remember correctly, and once again the Air Force was having one of their silly exercises. And I started the leg of the run, and I got to my duty state, or my station, where I was to evaluate a casualty. And they didn't have any visible wounds on this guy, but they just mentioned a few things like heat stroke or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And then they said, "Oh, by the way, what if you came upon a soldier lying face down in the dirt with no visible wounds or no visible bleeding or anything like that? What would you look for?" I shocked them. I said, "Snake bite." They're like, "What?" I go, "Yeah, you look for a snake bite." I said, "I grew up in the mountains of Colorado." I said, I never saw really any snakes up there, but you know, I Boy Scout and everything else, so I know a little about nature. So I passed the baton on to my teammate. He takes off running. He gets about 100 yards, and 3, 4, 5 Air Force guys tackle him. Meanwhile, there's like 200 or 300 participants and audience members standing. They're all going, "Oh, what the heck's going on?" So I run over there because the drill sergeant pointed at me, you know, like, "Go take care of the situation." They almost had this guy in handcuffs. Once again, they're having one of their fun exercises, and they're like, "What are you Army guys doing running around with M16s?" I said, "That's a dummy M16 if you look at it." "Oh." And I said, "Don't you see all these people standing over here?" And I point off into the direction. And this is the first time they notice a crowd of 200 to 300 people are soldiers. And I'm like, "Yeah, we're doing Soldier Sweepstakes." "What?" It's kind of like a relay race." "Oh, well, we almost arrested your soldier here." Seriously. Because they were conducting less than 100 feet from us, another building with bad guys in it. They did not see 200 to 300 Army soldiers to the side. Speaking of PT, physical training, like I said, we would do exercise at one end of the flight line because there was a big open field down there. We'd do our push-ups and our sit-ups and whatever else they felt like doing that day, jumping jacks, the stretching and everything else. And then we used to run the fence line, and it was unpaved. It was a dirt road, but it was near the runways, and that's where we did PT. Well, Air Force Base. First complaint, you Army guys are coming into the chow hall all dirty and sweaty and smelling. Because basically, by the time we got done with PT, the chow hall was open, and some soldiers would go there to eat. Some soldiers would go there to get their meals and take it up to their room, eat their meal while they were getting prepped for the day, after taking a shower, because they had takeout trays. So, policy came down. We could no longer go from PT to the chow hall because the Air Force complained. We had a lot of soldiers, and I mean by soldiers I meant they already had an MOS. We had a lot of soldiers back then that bared over into 98 Charlie and 98 Golf, which was the linguists, because we had Charlies and Golfs there, the linguists, at this school. So we had a lot of soldiers. They could not live with us trainees because the soldiers and trainees are not supposed to intermix due to the UCMJ, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. So they gave them a barracks building, which was right next door to the Air Force trainees. Didn't make a lot of sense to me. So one weekend, these guys got together, got some lumber, got some paint, and put up a sign, Fort Goodfellow. Air Force complained again. You Army guys can't put up a Fort Goodfellow sign. This is an Air Force base. So they had to take it down. Like I said, this is my start of getting to not like the Air Force. And as I explained, my Air Force classmates who did not know how to run a buffer or anything like that. Let's see what I got a big list here. I'm still working on it. Did a little bit of show and tell. That might be it for today. Oh yeah, the barracks room. Name drop, Victor Buffington was my first roommate. He was young enough to almost be my son, and we ended up having a father-son. He called me father or dad, and I called him son. Well, we lived in a 3-man room. I had the single bunk next to the door, and he took the lower bunk of the bunk bed that was next to the window. I was at Goodfellow Air Force Base from July to December. About August, the transformer to our air conditioning unit for our barracks building blew up. And it was during the hot part of the summer. So for about 4 or 5 days, we had no AC running in this building. And I would literally take a shower in my sleepwear, which is generally PT clothes. I would take a shower, a cold shower, and just stay wet, just enough to get wet, come back to the bed, fall on the bed, wet, and within 30 minutes, all that wet would just be sweat. That's how bad it was. And every time the wind blew, it blew opposite of our window. It wouldn't blow through the window, it would blow across the window. So we had a tough time. But like I said, I couldn't believe the Air Force. Because also prior to me getting there, when I started Common Core, one of our Army guys came in and said, oh yeah, by the way, because when I joined the Army back then, you did not surrender your ID card. If someone's asked to look at it, you would hold it in your hand and you could say, here. You're not supposed to hand it over to them. Well, the SPs, the security police for the Air Force, run the Goodfellow Air Force gates. So two of our Army instructors, before I got there, were coming through the gate. They were asked to surrender their IDs. One of the guys said, "Sorry, we're in the Army. We don't surrender our IDs." Well, they were outside the car getting handcuffed and everything else, and caused a big stink because, of course, the Air Force base commander had to call the highest ranking Army commander, and they had a policy now, if the Air Force SPs ask you for your ID, surrender it to them so you don't get in any trouble. Gotta hate the Air Force. And I even got a scarier story when I finally become a warrant officer and get stationed at Lackland Air Force Base. Real scary story. I think that's all I got for today. I've done PT, I've done how I don't like the Air Force, I did soldier sweepstakes. I'm more relaxed, I'm really enjoying these talks. I just hope I can just continue along, and one of these days maybe I'll get more listeners. And remember, freedom is not free. Hug a vet. Well, you can't hug a vet. Well, if you want to hug a vet, thank a vet. Cheap out.